The day started like any other for Judge Marcus Reed, a man whose life was defined by discipline and integrity. As one of the few black Supreme Court judges in the country, he carried himself with an air of quiet confidence that commanded respect without demanding it. That morning, after attending a high-profile conference on civil rights, Judge Reed boarded a flight bound for his hometown. He had been looking forward to reuniting with his family, a wife who always greeted him with warmth and two teenage children eager to share stories about their week. The airport buzzed with activity as travelers rushed to catch their flights. Families huddled together near gates, businessmen typed furiously on laptops while waiting in line, and tourists snapped photos of every corner they passed. For Judge Reed, airports were familiar territory. Over the years, he'd grown accustomed to long security checks, cramped seats, and delayed departures. But today felt different, not because of anything specific, but because of the lingering exhaustion from days filled with intense discussions at the conference. All he wanted was a smooth journey home. As he stepped onto the plane, Judge Reed scanned the cabin. It was packed, with barely enough space to maneuver between rows. The hum of conversations blended with the sound of overhead compartments slamming shut as passengers stowed away bags. He made his way to his assigned seat near the front, nodding politely at those around him. His briefcase, containing notes from the conference and documents related to upcoming cases, rested securely beside him under the seat in front. A young flight attendant approached shortly after everyone settled in. She wore a crisp uniform and held a clipboard tightly against her chest. Her face set in what seemed like a permanent expression of stress. Her name tag read Jessica, though Judge Reed didn't pay much attention to it. At first glance, she appeared efficient, moving quickly down the aisle to ensure all passengers followed pre-flight procedures. When she reached his row, she asked if everything was okay with his belongings. Judge Reed smiled faintly and assured her everything was fine, but moments later, trouble began brewing further back in the cabin. A middle-aged woman struggled to fit her oversized carry-on into the overhead bin. Frustrated, she called out for assistance, but no one responded immediately. Passengers nearby either ignored her plight or offered half-hearted suggestions that only added to the confusion. The delay caused a ripple effect, slowing down the boarding process significantly. Tension mounted as more people joined the queue. Outside the aircraft, anxious to board before takeoff, Jessica returned to the scene, visibly irritated by now. Her earlier polite demeanor had vanished, replaced by impatience. "Ma'am, please move your bag," she instructed sharply, her voice cutting through the noise. The woman tried explaining that the compartment was full, but Jessica wasn't having it. "This isn't rocket science," she shot back, earning disapproving looks from several passengers. It wasn't until Jessica reached Judge Reed's row again that things took a turn. By this point, her frustration had boiled over, spilling into interactions with anyone unlucky enough to cross her path. Spotting his briefcase tucked neatly under the seat, she stopped abruptly. "Sir, I need you to put that under the seat properly," she said, pointing at the item. Judge Reed glanced down, puzzled. "It is under the seat," he replied calmly, gesturing toward the luggage already positioned exactly where it should be. Instead of clarifying or apologizing, Jessica leaned closer, her tone escalating. "No, sir, it needs to go completely underneath." Before Judge Reed could respond, she pushed his arm lightly, just enough to make her point but firm enough to startle him. The unexpected physical contact caught him off guard. What shocked him even more, however, was the anger in her voice when she yelled, "Do you understand? We can't leave unless you comply." Passengers nearby turned their heads, some whispering among themselves while others stared openly. To many, the exchange seemed disproportionate. Why would a simple request about a briefcase warrant such hostility? For Judge Reed, the moment felt surreal. Here he was, a respected judge used to commanding courtrooms with authority, being spoken to as though he were deliberately causing trouble. And yet there was something else beneath Jessica's words, an undertone that couldn't be ignored. Was it prejudice, bias, or simply unchecked frustration? He chose not to react impulsively. Instead, he maintained his composure, speaking slowly and clearly. I'm happy to cooperate, ma'am. But I believe my bag is already where it's supposed to be. His calmness stood in stark contrast to Jessica's growing agitation. Rather than backing down, she doubled down, raising her voice louder still. "You're holding up the entire plane," she exclaimed, drawing even more attention to the situation. By now, murmurs spread throughout the cabin. Some passengers exchanged sympathetic glances, silently siding with Judge Reed. Others pulled out their phones, instinctively recording the confrontation. An elderly man seated across the aisle leaned over to mutter to his companion, "This doesn't feel right. He's just trying to help." Meanwhile, a young woman sitting behind them whispered to her friend, "She's treating him like he's done something wrong." For Judge Reed, the weight of the moment wasn't lost. He understood that this wasn't merely about a misplaced bag. It was about power dynamics, implicit bias, and the subtle ways racism manifested in everyday interactions. Though he'd faced discrimination before, rarely had it occurred so publicly in such a confined space with dozens of witnesses watching. Still, he refused to let anger dictate his response. Years of experience had taught him that staying level-headed often yielded better results than reacting emotionally. Jessica, however, showed no signs of relenting. Her body language grew increasingly confrontational, her words sharper with each passing second. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether to intervene or remain silent spectators. The tension thickened, making the cabin feel smaller and more suffocating. Everyone knew this wouldn't end quietly, but none could predict how dramatically the situation would escalate next. The confrontation between Judge Marcus Reed and Jessica, the flight attendant, had reached a boiling point. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances as the tension in the cabin grew thicker with each passing second. Judge Reed's calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to Jessica's escalating frustration. Her voice, loud and sharp, echoed through the plane, drawing even more attention to the unfolding drama. "Sir, this isn't optional," she snapped, her tone dripping with irritation. "You need to comply now." Judge Reed remained seated, his expression unreadable but composed. He didn't raise his voice or make any sudden movements. Instead, he spoke softly, almost as if trying to defuse the situation. "Ma'am," he said, his words deliberate and measured, "I'm not refusing to cooperate. My briefcase is already under the seat, exactly where it's supposed to be." His calmness seemed to only fuel Jessica's anger further. Jessica leaned down slightly, her face inches from Judge Reed's. Her eyes narrowed, and her lips tightened into a thin line. "That's not good enough," she shot back, her voice rising yet again. "If you can't follow basic instructions, maybe you shouldn't be on this flight." The comment sent shockwaves through the cabin. Gasps rippled through the rows of passengers, some of whom whispered audibly about how inappropriate the remark sounded. Even those who hadn't been paying close attention earlier now turned their heads, curious about what was happening. For Judge Reed, the moment carried layers of meaning. On the surface, it was a disagreement over luggage placement, a trivial matter that could have been resolved with a simple clarification. But beneath the surface, something deeper was at play. Jessica's tone wasn't just impatient, it carried an edge of condescension, as though she viewed him not as a passenger deserving respect, but as someone deliberately causing trouble. And then there was the racial undertone, an unspoken bias that Judge Reed recognized all too well. It wasn't the first time he'd encountered such treatment, but rarely had it been so blatant. Despite the mounting pressure, Judge Reed refused to let his emotions take control. Years of presiding over courtrooms had taught him the value of patience and restraint. He knew that reacting impulsively would only escalate the situation further. So instead of raising his voice or arguing back, he maintained his composure. "Ma'am," he repeated, his voice steady, "I'm happy to do whatever is required, but I need clarity. Can you explain what exactly needs to change?" Jessica hesitated for a split second, caught off guard by his unwavering calmness. For a brief moment, it seemed like she might soften her approach, but instead, she doubled down, her tone growing even harsher. "People like you always think you're above the rules," she muttered under her breath, though loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. The comment struck a nerve, not just with Judge Reed, but also with those around him. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats while others exchanged disapproving looks. One elderly woman seated across the aisle leaned over to whisper to her husband, "Did she really just say that? That poor man is doing everything right." Another passenger, a young man wearing headphones, paused his music to record the scene unfolding before him. He held up his phone discreetly, capturing the heated exchange without drawing attention to himself. Wordlessly, videos began circulating among passengers, shared via text messages and social media apps. Within minutes, snippets of the altercation were being uploaded online, tagged with hashtags like Myung Flight Attendant Meltdown and We Respect Passengers. As the argument dragged on, the mood in the cabin shifted from curiosity to discomfort. A mother traveling with 2 young children glanced nervously at her kids, unsure whether to shield them from the spectacle or explain what was happening. A businessman in a tailored suit sighed heavily, muttering under his breath about delays and missed meetings. Others simply stared wide-eyed, waiting to see how the situation would resolve itself or spiral further out of control. Jessica, perhaps realizing the growing scrutiny, tried to regain authority. She straightened her posture and addressed Judge Reed one last time, her voice louder than ever. "Sir, either fix your bag or step aside so we can move forward." With that, she turned on her heel and marched toward the front of the plane, leaving behind a trail of murmurs and whispers. Passengers watched her go, their expressions ranging from confusion to outright disapproval. Judge Reed sat quietly, processing the interaction. While he understood that people sometimes acted out of stress or frustration, this felt different. There was an unmistakable element of disrespect, a dismissal of his identity and status that couldn't be ignored. As he glanced around the cabin, he noticed several passengers nodding subtly in solidarity. One woman seated directly behind him leaned forward and whispered, "Thank you for staying calm. That was completely unnecessary." Momentime later, as the commotion died down and passengers resumed settling into their seats, Judge Reed made a decision. Pulling out his phone, he scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he needed. It belonged to David Monroe, the CEO of the airline, a connection Judge Reed had formed years ago during a corporate legal seminar. Taking a deep breath, he dialed the number. After a few rings, the call connected. "David, it's Marcus Reed," he said, keeping his tone professional. "I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time, but I need to bring something to your attention." On the other end of the line, David Monroe listened intently as Judge Reed recounted the incident. He described Jessica's behavior, the raised voice, the dismissive remarks, the physical contact, and emphasized its implications. "This isn't just about me," Judge Reed explained. "It's about setting expectations for how passengers are treated regardless of who they are." David Monroe, recognizing the gravity of the complaint coming from such a prominent figure, assured Judge Reed that immediate action would be taken. "Consider this handled," he promised, his voice firm. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to most passengers, ground staff at the airport were already alerted to the brewing controversy on board. Supervisors scrambled to assess the situation, aware that public perception of their airline hung precariously in the balance. Back on the plane, the atmosphere remained tense. Though Jessica had retreated to the galley, her presence loomed large. Over the cabin, passengers whispered among themselves, speculating about what might happen next. Would the flight proceed as scheduled, or would the altercation lead to further complications? No one anticipated just how dramatic the resolution would be, or how quickly events would unfold. For Judge Reed, the decision to call the CEO wasn't made lightly. He understood the potential consequences of involving top-level executives, especially given the public nature of the incident. But he also believed strongly in accountability. If left unchecked, such behavior risked perpetuating harmful stereotypes and reinforcing systemic biases. By taking action, he hoped to send a message not just to the airline but to society at large, that disrespect could not go unchallenged. As the minutes ticked by, anticipation filled the air. Passengers fidgeted in their seats, glancing periodically at their watches or phones. Some debated whether to speak up themselves while others chose to remain silent observers. What everyone agreed on, however, was that something significant was about to happen, and when it did, it would leave a lasting impact on everyone involved. The tension in the cabin lingered like a storm cloud, heavy and oppressive. Passengers exchanged nervous glances, their earlier excitement for the journey replaced by uncertainty. Judge Marcus Reed sat quietly in his seat, his phone resting on his lap as he waited for the next move. He knew that calling the CEO of the airline had been a bold step, but it was necessary. The incident wasn't just about him. It was about accountability, respect, and addressing systemic issues that continued to plague society. Minutes passed, though they felt much longer to those on board. Then, suddenly, the intercom crackled to life, startling everyone. Instead of the usual cheerful voice of the pilot or flight attendant announcing pre-flight procedures, a deeper, more authoritative tone filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Airport Operations speaking." The voice began, formal and clipped. "Due to unforeseen circumstances, we regret to inform you that this flight will not depart as scheduled." A collective gasp rippled through the plane. Passengers turned to one another, wide-eyed and confused. "What does that mean?" someone whispered loudly from the back. Others echoed similar questions, their voices rising in volume as panic set in. Was there a mechanical issue? A security threat or something else entirely? For Judge Reed, the announcement came as no surprise. He had anticipated some form of intervention after his conversation with David Monroe, the airline's CEO. Still, hearing it confirmed aloud sent a ripple of satisfaction through him. Not because he enjoyed causing disruption, but because it validated his belief that such behavior couldn't go unchecked. If nothing else, the delay signaled that the airline took the matter seriously. Meanwhile, Jessica, the flight attendant at the center of the controversy, was summoned off the plane. Two uniformed officials appeared near the galley, speaking briefly with her before escorting her away. Her face flushed red, a mix of confusion and fear etched across her features. Passengers watched silently as she walked down the aisle, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Some felt a pang of sympathy for her. Others saw it as justice served. As soon as Jessica disappeared, whispers erupted throughout the cabin. Speculation ran rampant. One man leaned over to his neighbor and said, "She's probably fired already." Another woman shook her head knowingly. "No way. They'll just give her a slap on the wrist and send her back tomorrow." Yet despite differing opinions, one thing was clear. The altercation had left an indelible mark on everyone present. With the offending crew member removed, the airline scrambled to address the disruption. Replacement staff boarded hastily, apologizing profusely to passengers for the inconvenience caused. A senior supervisor stepped forward, addressing the cabin directly. "We deeply regret any discomfort experienced during this process," he said, his tone sincere but rehearsed. "Please know that your safety and satisfaction remain our top priorities." Despite these assurances, skepticism lingered among passengers. Many wondered whether the apology extended beyond lip service, or if similar incidents occurred regularly behind closed doors. An older gentleman seated near Judge Reed muttered under his breath, "It's always the same story. Apologize today, forget tomorrow." His wife nodded in agreement, adding, "They only act when someone important complains." While most passengers focused on the immediate fallout, Judge Reed found himself reflecting on broader implications. Yes, the situation had been resolved, at least temporarily. But what about the underlying issues? How often did people of color face similar treatment without recourse? How many incidents went unreported because individuals lacked the resources or connections to hold institutions accountable? These thoughts weighed heavily on him, reminding him once again why advocacy mattered so deeply. As replacement attendants moved through the cabin, helping passengers stow bags and prepare for departure, Judge Reed noticed subtle changes in how he was treated. The new staff members were polite, almost overly so, ensuring every need was met promptly. Whether this shift stemmed from genuine professionalism or heightened awareness of scrutiny remained unclear. Either way, it highlighted the power dynamics at play, a reminder that respect should never depend on public pressure. Nearby, a middle-aged black woman seated 2 rows ahead turned slightly to glance at Judge Reed. Their eyes met briefly, and she offered a small, knowing smile. It was a gesture of solidarity, acknowledging shared experiences of discrimination. For a moment, Judge Reed considered approaching her to strike up a conversation, but decided against it. This wasn't the time or place for personal exchanges, not when emotions still ran high. Instead, he focused inward, processing the events of the past hour. While vindicated, he recognized that victories like this were fleeting. True progress required persistence far greater than a single phone call or delayed flight. Each act of resistance, no matter how small, contributed to a larger movement toward equality. And though today's outcome felt satisfying, tomorrow promised new battles awaiting engagement. Eventually, the boarding process resumed, albeit with noticeable tension. Passengers eyed each other warily, unsure whether to discuss the earlier drama or pretend it never happened. Some openly vented their frustrations, criticizing the airline's handling of the situation. Others chose silence, preferring to avoid conflict altogether. But regardless of individual reactions, the atmosphere remained charged, a testament to the lingering impact of what had transpired. Judge Reed, however, remained composed. As the plane taxied down the runway, he glanced out the window watching the tarmac blur into motion. He thought about the countless lives touched by moments like this, not just his own but also those of strangers who might draw inspiration from his actions. By standing firm and demanding accountability, he hoped to spark courage in others to confront injustice head-on. Because ultimately, change didn't happen in isolation. It required collective effort, unwavering determination, and faith in the possibility of a better future. Though turbulence inevitably lay ahead, both literal and metaphorical, hope soared higher than ever before. As the plane finally lifted off the ground, the mood inside the cabin began to shift. The initial chaos caused by the altercation had subsided, replaced by a mix of relief and lingering unease. Passengers glanced at one another cautiously, unsure whether to discuss what had happened or let it fade into the background. For many, the incident was still fresh in their minds, a vivid reminder of how quickly ordinary moments could spiral into extraordinary confrontations. Judge Marcus Reed sat quietly in his seat, staring out the window as clouds drifted past. His thoughts raced, replaying the events that had unfolded earlier. He knew the situation wasn't just about him. It was symbolic of larger societal issues. While he felt vindicated by the airline's swift response, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only a small step toward addressing deeper systemic problems. Justice, after all, wasn't achieved through isolated victories. It required sustained effort and collective action. Around him, passengers whispered among themselves, speculating about what would happen next. Some assumed Jessica, the flight attendant, had been fired on the spot. Others guessed she'd face disciplinary action but remain employed. A few even defended her, arguing that stress and long hours might have pushed her over the edge. "She probably didn't mean anything personal," one man said to his companion. "People make mistakes when they're under pressure." But Judge Reed knew better. Mistakes were one thing, deliberate disrespect was another. And while he understood that everyone had bad days, there was no excuse for treating someone poorly based on implicit bias or prejudice. What troubled him most was how easily such behavior could go unchallenged if left unchecked. Without accountability, harmful patterns persisted, perpetuating cycles of inequality and discrimination. As the flight continued, curiosity got the better of some passengers. One woman seated nearby leaned over and asked hesitantly, "Excuse me, sir, are you okay?" Her tone was gentle, almost apologetic, as though she feared intruding. Judge Reed turned to face her, offering a faint smile. "I'm fine, thank you," he replied calmly. "Just thinking." Encouraged by his politeness, she pressed further. "What happened back there?" I mean, with the flight attendant, was it because of your bag? Judge Reed nodded slowly. It started that way, he admitted, choosing his words carefully. But sometimes these situations are about more than just luggage. The woman frowned, clearly intrigued. You mean like racism? She asked bluntly. Her question hung in the air, drawing stares from neighboring passengers who overheard. Judge Reed hesitated for a moment before responding. Let's just say it's complicated, he said diplomatically. But yes, biases play a role in how people interact, not always intentionally, but often in ways we don't realize. His answer seemed to resonate with those around him. Another passenger chimed in, sharing a story of being profiled at an airport years ago. They pulled me aside for extra screening, he explained, shaking his head. No explanation, just assumptions. It made me feel powerless. Others nodded in agreement, recounting similar experiences. A young mother recounted how security personnel once questioned her son simply because he wore a hoodie. Each story added layers to the conversation, highlighting the pervasive nature of discrimination. For Judge Reed, hearing these accounts reinforced his belief in the importance of speaking up. Silence, he knew, only enabled injustice to thrive. By challenging unacceptable behavior, even in seemingly minor situations, he hoped to inspire others to do the same. Change began with awareness, and awareness started with dialogue. Meanwhile, news of the incident began spreading beyond the confines of the plane. Videos recorded by passengers during the altercation had already gone viral online, sparking heated debates across social media platforms. Hashtags like flight attendant racism and accountability in action trended within hours, drawing attention from journalists and activists alike. Comment sections exploded with opinions, ranging from outrage to skepticism. Some praised Judge Reed for standing his ground, calling him a hero. Others dismissed the incident as overblown, accusing him of making a mountain out of a molehill. Back on the plane, however, the focus remained on the immediate aftermath. Replacement staff worked diligently to restore normalcy, ensuring passengers felt comfortable despite the earlier disruption. Meals were served promptly and attendants went out of their way to be accommodating. Yet beneath the surface-level professionalism, tension lingered. Many passengers couldn't help but wonder whether the changes were genuine or merely performative, an attempt to salvage the airline's reputation. One elderly man seated near Judge Reed leaned over and whispered, "This kind of thing happens more often than people think. Most folks don't have the platform to fight back." His voice carried a note of bitterness tempered by resignation. But maybe this time will be different. Judge Reed considered the man's words carefully. While he appreciated the sentiment, he knew real change wouldn't come overnight. Holding individuals accountable was important, but systemic reform required structural shifts, policy changes, education, and consistent enforcement of anti-discrimination measures. Still, every act of resistance planted seeds for progress. Even small victories like today's contributed to a larger narrative of advocacy and empowerment. As the flight approached its destination, conversations tapered off, giving way to quiet reflection. Passengers settled into their seats, preparing for landing. For Judge Reed, the journey home felt bittersweet. On one hand, he was eager to reunite with his family and leave the day's drama behind. On the other, he recognized the significance of what had transpired and the responsibility that came with it. When the plane touched down, applause erupted spontaneously throughout the cabin. It was a rare occurrence, usually reserved for turbulent flights or emergency landings. But this time the cheers carried a different meaning, a mix of gratitude, relief, and solidarity. Passengers disembarked slowly, exchanging nods and smiles as they filed out of the aircraft. Several stopped to thank Judge Reed personally, praising him for his composure and courage. Outside the terminal, reporters waited eagerly, microphones in hand and cameras rolling. Word of the incident had traveled fast and media outlets clamored for details. As Judge Reed stepped into view, flashes of light illuminated his face, temporarily blinding him. Questions flew from all directions. Judge Reed, can you tell us what happened on the flight? Do you believe the airline handled the situation appropriately? Will you pursue legal action? He raised a hand to signal for silence, his expression calm but firm. Thank you for your interest, he began, addressing the crowd. While I appreciate the attention this incident has received, my focus remains on fostering meaningful dialogue about respect and accountability. Discrimination exists in many forms, and combating it requires collective effort. That's where our energy should be directed. His statement drew murmurs of approval from bystanders, many of whom applauded softly. Reporters jotted down notes furiously, eager to capture his words verbatim. Though Judge Reed declined further interviews, promising to release a written statement later, his message resonated deeply. By framing the incident as part of a broader conversation, he shifted the narrative away from individual grievances and toward systemic solutions. As he walked away, surrounded by family members who greeted him warmly, Judge Reed allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. Today's victory, though small, represented progress, and progress, no matter how incremental, was worth celebrating. The days following the flight passed quickly, but the incident refused to fade from public consciousness. News outlets continued to cover the story extensively, dissecting every detail and angle. Social media buzzed with debates, opinions, and personal anecdotes shared by people who felt compelled to weigh in. For Judge Marcus Reed, the attention was both overwhelming and humbling. While he appreciated the support pouring in from strangers across the globe, he also recognized the weight of responsibility that came with being thrust into the spotlight. Reporters hounded him for interviews, eager to capture his perspective on what had transpired. Some framed the incident as a clash between authority figures, an esteemed judge versus an overzealous flight attendant, while others highlighted the racial undertones, emphasizing how systemic bias is often manifested in everyday interactions. Despite the constant requests, Judge Reed declined most opportunities to speak publicly. Instead, he chose a more thoughtful approach, penning an op-ed piece for a major newspaper. In the article, titled, "Respect is not optional, accountability in everyday life," Judge Reed articulated his thoughts with clarity and precision. He began by recounting the events of the flight, describing them not as isolated occurrences, but as symptoms of deeper societal issues. What happened on that plane wasn't just about me or my briefcase, he wrote. It was a reflection of how bias and prejudice can seep into our daily lives, often without us realizing it. He went on to explain that while individuals must be held accountable for their actions, true change required addressing systemic flaws. We cannot dismantle racism or discrimination by focusing solely on individual incidents, he argued. We need policies that promote fairness, training programs that foster empathy, and environments where everyone feels valued and respected. The piece concluded with a call to action, urging readers to challenge discriminatory practices wherever they encountered them. Progress demands courage, he wrote. Courage to speak up, courage to listen, and courage to demand better. The Ursum op-ed resonated deeply with audiences, sparking widespread acclaim. Readers praised Judge Reed not only for his legal expertise, but also for his moral leadership. Many viewed him as a champion of social justice, someone willing to use his platform to advocate for meaningful reform. Social media lit up with hashtags like "Listen to Judge Reed" and "Demand Better," amplifying his message far beyond the original audience. Educators incorporated excerpts from the article into classroom discussions, while activists cited it during rallies advocating for equality. Meanwhile, the airline faced mounting pressure to address the fallout. Public outrage forced executives to take swift and visible action. Within days of the incident, the company issued a formal apology, acknowledging the harm caused by Jessica's behavior and pledging to implement sweeping changes. In a press conference broadcast live online, David Monroe, the CEO, stood alongside other senior leaders to outline their plan. "We are committed to creating a culture of respect and inclusivity," he declared. "This starts with accountability and extends to every level of our organization." Among the proposed measures were mandatory sensitivity training sessions for all employees, revamped protocols for handling passenger complaints, and increased oversight of customer service interactions. Additionally, the airline announced plans to establish an advisory board composed of diversity experts and community advocates to ensure ongoing progress. Critics argued that these steps amounted to little more than performative gestures, designed to placate public anger rather than effect real change. Supporters, however, acknowledged even incremental improvements represented progress worth celebrating. Jessica, the flight attendant at the center of the controversy, became a polarizing figure in her own right. After being removed from the plane, she reportedly underwent internal investigation procedures. Rumors swirled about her fate within the company, ranging from termination to suspension without pay. Eventually, the airline confirmed that she had been placed on administrative leave, pending further review. While some defended her, citing job stress and human error, others condemned her actions as unacceptable regardless of context. Her name trended briefly on social media, accompanied by heated arguments about accountability versus forgiveness. For Judge Reed, the focus remained less on punishment and more on prevention. He understood that singling out one individual wouldn't solve the root problem. What mattered most was fostering environments where such behavior couldn't thrive unchecked. During a rare interview granted to a trusted journalist, he emphasized this point. Holding people accountable is important, yes, he said. But we must also ask ourselves, why did this happen? What systems allowed it? And how do we prevent it from happening again? His words struck a chord with many, particularly those who had experienced similar treatment firsthand. One woman reached out via email, sharing her gratitude for his advocacy. "I've been treated poorly by airlines before, but I never spoke up because I didn't think anyone would care," she wrote. "Your action showed me that standing up for yourself isn't futile. It's powerful." Another man sent a handwritten letter thanking Judge Reed for inspiring him to file a complaint after years of enduring disrespectful service at restaurants and stores. These messages reinforced Judge Reed's belief in the ripple effect of resistance. Even small acts of courage could ignite larger movements. As weeks turned into months, the incident gradually faded from headlines, replaced by newer stories vying for public attention. Yet its impact endured. Airlines nationwide began reviewing their customer service policies, spurred by the backlash faced by the carrier involved in the altercation. Passengers reported noticing subtle shifts in staff behavior, from more polite greetings to greater willingness to resolve disputes amicably. Whether these changes stemmed from genuine reform or heightened awareness of scrutiny remained unclear, but the overall atmosphere improved noticeably. For Judge Reed, life returned to a semblance of normalcy. He resumed his duties at the Supreme Court, presiding over cases with the same dedication and fairness that defined his career. But the experience stayed with him, shaping how he approached advocacy moving forward. He accepted invitations to speak at conferences and universities, using his platform to educate others about the importance of confronting bias and promoting inclusivity. Each speech, each panel discussion, served as a reminder that progress required persistence, not just in courtrooms but in every corner of society. At home, his family noticed a renewed sense of purpose in him. His teenage son once asked, "Dad, why do you keep talking about this stuff? Don't you ever get tired of fighting?" Judge Reed smiled gently, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Fighting implies anger, son," he replied. "What I'm doing isn't fighting, it's building. We're building a world where no one has to endure disrespect simply because of who they are. That kind of work doesn't tire me, it fuels me." And so, despite the challenges and complexities of navigating public discourse, Judge Reed pressed on. He knew the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, but he believed wholeheartedly in the power of collective effort. Every act of resistance, no matter how small, contributed to a broader movement toward equality. And though turbulence inevitably lay ahead, hope soared higher than ever before. Months passed since the infamous flight incident, but its echoes continued to reverberate through society. The story of Judge Marcus Reed and the flight attendant had become more than just a viral moment. It was a catalyst for change, sparking conversations about respect, accountability, and systemic bias in ways few could have predicted. For Judge Reed, the experience was transformative. It reinforced his belief that even seemingly small acts of resistance could ignite larger movements toward justice. In the months following the incident, Judge Reed found himself increasingly sought after as a speaker and advocate. Universities invited him to deliver keynote addresses at commencement ceremonies, while civil rights organizations requested his participation in panel discussions. His speeches were always grounded in humility, emphasizing not just what he had done but what others could do too. Change doesn't happen because one person stands up, he often said. It happens when many people stand together. One particularly memorable event took place at a national conference on diversity and inclusion. Hundreds of attendees filled the auditorium, eager to hear from Judge Reed. As he stepped onto the stage, dressed in his signature tailored suit, the room erupted into applause. He began by recounting the events of the flight, framing them not as a tale of personal triumph but as an example of how everyday moments could highlight larger societal issues. "What happened to me wasn't unique," he explained, pacing slowly across the stage. "Many of you here today have faced similar treatment, whether it's being followed in stores, questioned at airports, or dismissed in professional settings. These experiences aren't isolated incidents. They're symptoms of systemic problems." Pausing briefly, he scanned the audience before continuing. "The question isn't whether these things will happen again. They will. The real question is, what are we going to do about it?" His words resonated deeply with listeners, many of whom nodded in agreement or scribbled notes furiously. Afterward, dozens lined up to speak with him personally, sharing their own stories of discrimination and gratitude for his advocacy. One young woman approached hesitantly, clutching a notebook tightly against her chest. "Your story gave me the courage to confront my boss about unfair treatment at work," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "Thank you for showing me that speaking up matters." These interactions reminded Judge Reed why he chose to remain vocal despite the challenges. While public life brought scrutiny and occasional criticism, it also created opportunities to inspire others. Each handshake, each heartfelt message served as a reminder that advocacy wasn't just about grand gestures. It was about fostering connection and empowering individuals to demand better. Meanwhile, the airline involved in the incident worked tirelessly to rebuild its reputation. True to their promises, they implemented sensitivity training programs for employees and established partnerships with diversity consultants to ensure sustained progress. Feedback mechanisms were introduced, allowing passengers to report concerns anonymously without fear of retaliation. Though some skeptics dismissed these efforts as superficial attempts to polish a tarnished image, others acknowledged the importance of starting somewhere, even if incremental steps felt slow. Jessica, the flight attendant whose actions sparked the controversy, remained out of the public eye. Rumors circulated periodically about her whereabouts and employment status. Though nothing definitive emerged, some speculated she had left the industry altogether, unable to cope with the backlash. Others suggested she might return under stricter supervision, given another chance to prove herself. Regardless of her fate, her role in the incident underscored the need for accountability, not just for individuals but for institutions enabling harmful behaviors. Back home, Judge Reed's family adapted to his newfound prominence. His wife, Sarah, juggled managing household responsibilities with supporting her husband's growing commitments. Their teenage children, initially reluctant to discuss the incident publicly, gradually embraced their father's mission. His daughter joined her school's debate team, using her platform to argue passionately for equality and fairness. His son started volunteering with local youth organizations, mentoring younger students and encouraging them to speak out against injustice. Despite the positive outcomes, Judge Reed remained acutely aware of the work still needed. Progress, he knew, was rarely linear. There would be setbacks, moments when cynicism threatened to overshadow hope. But he believed firmly in humanity's capacity for growth, if only people remained willing to listen, learn, and act. One evening, as he sat in his study reviewing legal briefs, Judge Reed reflected on the journey thus far. The desk lamp cast, a warm glow over stacks of papers and books, illuminating photographs of his family placed strategically around the room. In one frame, he stood beside his wife and children during a vacation years ago, smiling broadly as waves crashed behind them. Another captured him mid-speech at a community event, his expression animated and earnest. He picked up the latter photograph, studying it thoughtfully. Advocacy wasn't easy. It demanded time, energy, and resilience. Yet every challenge came, with rewards far greater than any cost. Through his actions, he hoped to leave a legacy not just of legal achievements, but of compassion and integrity. A world where everyone, regardless of race, gender, or background, could live with dignity and respect. As he set the photo back down, his phone buzzed softly on the desk. Glancing at the screen, he saw a notification from social media. Someone had shared a clip of his recent speech, accompanied by the caption, "This is what leadership looks like." Smiling faintly, Judge Reed returned to his work, knowing the fight for justice would continue long after the headlines faded. For now, turbulence lingered, both literal and metaphorical. But so did hope. And as long as voices like Judge Reed's persisted, brighter skies lay ahead.